In this episode, we're going to take a look at Castlevania Season 4. I want to talk about two aspects of this season. First, I want to discuss Trevor Belmont's changing proximity to humanity and whether or not he becomes more or less powerful or good at what he does as he gets closer to humanity. I also want to take a look at the creative pros and cons of the ending here for Season 4 and whether or not it should have gone maybe a different route. So, if you're interested in talking about Season 4 of Castlevania, stick around. This episode is going to bite. This episode has bite. Now, first things first, spoiler alert. Don't say I didn't warn you. Now, as I mentioned in my Blood of Zeus video, I'm not the biggest anime fan in the world. However, I've always appreciated the narrative risks that it takes. I think you can make a good argument for this genre currently being the best one in terms of how it explores the heroic journey, which is something that I'm always interested in. Now, add in the fact that I'm an old NES head, and I remember frustratingly making my way through Castlevania 1 and 2 on the NES back in the day, and when I saw Castlevania pop up on Netflix a few years ago, that's all I needed to give it a shot, and I'm glad that I did. The animation itself is pretty typical for the genre. It's very visceral and angular and all of that. But where it really shines is how it constructs and coordinates the battle sequences, which I think, given how you have the various weapons and magic and stuff like that flying all over the place, I actually think it does a really nice job of making you feel the flow of action. And a particular shout out goes to those who animated and choreographed the fight scene with Carmella in Season 4 at the end. Whew, wow. Kudos to all of you. That was really well done. And even the storyline build up to that fight sequence was absolutely phenomenal. Wonderful job. If I had to nitpick anything about the series, quite honestly, it would probably be maybe the vocal mixing a little bit. There were times when characters, particularly Alucard, the son of Dracula, when he would kind of just mumble out of nowhere, me, 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 me. And I'd be like, what are you saying? And I'd have to look for the remote and go, okay, let's hear that again. But that was also kind of part of Alucard's character. That mumbling was showing his confusion and disconnect from the situation. I can't really say that it ruins the experience at all. I mean, no more than someone who interrupts a YouTube video to say, subscribe to my channel. I'm going to keep the background plot information here pretty brief for two reasons. First, when I started to write this out on my episode script, I realized, wow, this is a much more complex storyline than I gave it credit for, and it was just it just kept going on the page, way too long for a review video here. The second reason is, like I mentioned, I actually think that for someone who is not big into anime, I think you should check this out because the storyline, I think, is really going to suck you in. Ooh, suck you. That's not a good pun either. I'm sorry, my puns are terrible today. Castlevania is essentially a story about monsters, monster hunters, and those who are eaten. But it's not only the figures with large fangs and wings who are the actual monsters. I think Castlevania does a nice job of exploring the darkness within humanity and how we have a propensity to become our own monsters. Additionally, it takes a look at the life of the monster hunter, which is no glorious experience. It comes with a lot of bruises and broken bones and a lack of hope and a heaping helping of, well, complete and utter human disconnect, which takes us nicely into our protagonist, Trevor Belmont. One of the reasons why Trevor is so good at what he does is because at the beginning of the series, he's very disconnected from humanity. So all of the decisions that he makes, whether, it's just kind of where to go or how to approach a fight, generally the decisions are his own, and that makes him quite a fierce warrior. However, once he meets Sypha, he starts to become more connected to humanity again, especially by the end of the series here in season 4. And that prompts our question for the day. Is the hero more or less powerful the closer in proximity he or she gets to humanity? Now, on the surface, I think the answer is the hero becomes less powerful the more that they're connected to humanity. And the Spider-Man films, that's the Tobey Maguire ones from the early 2000s, I think that those films still do the best job of exploring this very issue. You might recall in the first Spider-Man film in 2002, the scene where the Green Goblin is at the top of the bridge and he's got a cable car full of people in one hand and Mary Jane in the other, and he, well, quite literally puts this premise into action, saying you can only choose one of the two. You can either choose the 50 people in the cable car or your one Mary Jane. Now, if we think about this logically, just purely mathematical for a second, the hero who's disconnected from humanity, this decision is probably an easy one for them to make. 50 is more than one, so I'm going to go after the 50 and be perfectly fine with sacrificing the one. I mean, on the surface, that's a pretty logical approach, and can you really say that it's a terrible one? That's a tough call. However, for the other side of the coin, the hero who is connected to humanity, both through feeling a kinship with the 50 people in that cable car and also having a special relationship with Mary Jane, the numbers don't quite work out the same way. I would argue that the hero who's more connected to humanity sees a balanced equation, essentially. It's not 50 versus 1, it's 1 to 1. That 50 people acts as a kind of collective one. And so you can't say that still one is more important than the other. Both are equally important, and therefore both must be saved. Now, can that be potentially dangerous? Of course, right? You're much more likely to lose both in that situation. But in the movie, you might recall that Peter Parker is able to save both. And the way that he's able to do so is through a kind of fear. When we think of fear, we tend to think of the idea of running away from a situation, right? Or we think of the deer in headlights, just kind of standing there in shock. But in reality, fear can also prompt incredible clarity of action. In that situation that we just mentioned with the Green Goblin and Spider-Man, he's not thinking about what's the best decision to make here. He simply knows I need to save both, and therefore I need to act. And that fear within him of losing both the 50 in the cable car and Mary Jane creates a very specific type of clarity of thought there that allows him to see a pathway to try to save both. The Greek philosopher Plato actually talks a little bit about this in Book 3 of the Republic, where he talks about the idea that we shouldn't show great men in literature at the time, think Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, that kind of stuff. We shouldn't show great men fearing death, because that would give license to our current young guardians, meaning those in Plato's time. It would give license to those guardians in his time to go into battle fearing the outcome, fearing the loss of their own lives. And that would lead them to not fight with quite as much gusto as they could have for the country or the state. Now, on the surface, this makes some sense, right? If someone is going into battle afraid, that could lead to what we talked about before, either running away or a complete and utter kind of inability to move or to make any decisions. But we can't dismiss the idea either that fear, to a certain degree, or at least having a certain amount of it, can also lead to that type of clarity that I mentioned as well, a clarity of purpose. Now, I say all of that because it was interesting to me to see the evolution of Trevor Belmont from the first season to this last season, season 4. You'll note, if you watch the series again, that Trevor actually becomes he becomes less efficient in fighting for himself from season 1 to season 4. He's not quite as crisp as he used to be, actually. But he becomes something else entirely by the time we get to season 4, because he's connected now to humanity, and not even just Sypha. Even the way he speaks to other people changes from season 1 to season 4. And having that connection to humanity by season 4 actually makes him a much fiercer warrior when he's fighting for someone else. And that's something that made me think about how we live our lives today. The closer or more proximity we have to humanity, to those we love, to others, the more we can become something greater than I even think we might have become when we stand and fight for ourselves. And that's an interesting proposition to think about. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit here about the ending of season 4. So, one last spoiler alert if you don't want to see it. You can always come back to this review. I'll have a timestamp below for it. Okay, so I did like the ending actually quite a bit. And I'm not going to lie, I smiled when I saw Belmont kind of come back on the horse. It was nice to see. However, and take what I'm about to say not as a criticism, take it as just a creative thought process here. I do kind of think that I would have liked the ending better if they had just let Belmont die. Hear me out. If you end the series, or at least that season, with Belmont dead and Sypha pregnant and Alucard building that, town of Belmont, if you will, or village of Belmont, the series could have opened up in a very intriguing way. You could have had, let's say, the next heir of Belmont, whoever that was going to be, and at the same time, though, you still would have had a connection to the original storyline, the first 4 seasons. This is a pretty unique place to be for a narrative, actually. We could have watched the, Belmont child grow up, train for what they were going to become. Obviously, they'd become a monster hunter as well. And we could have had fun conversations about which Belmont you preferred. I mean, again, this is not in a negative way, but it could have just been fun. Do you prefer Trevor or do you prefer this other Belmont child? Kind of like when people talk about captains from Star Trek, Captain Kirk or Jean-Luc Picard, that kind of a thing. You were still going to have Dracula, his wife, and Alucard at the very least, right? And so that would always give you a way to connect back to the original storyline, which is fantastic. That's something that I think Star Wars tried to do in these last 3 movies, is to have a new pathway forward, but still a connection to the old one. But they did it in a rather clumsy way and left a lot of people with a bad taste in their mouth. I actually think Castlevania could have done this really well, as opposed to continuing the story with Sypha, Trevor Belmont, and Alucard, and Dracula, and whatnot. Now, I'm not saying that I won't watch it or anything, and I'm not saying that it still can't be done even. I just think having a closed-off narrative with Trevor here would have been a powerful, wonderful ending for the series. Now, to be fair, I'm one of those people who actually likes to see authors kill off their characters and create a closed-ended narrative. But am I alone here? I mean, let me know in the comments below. Was anybody else interested in possibly seeing the series just end right there, or at least this part of the series end with the death of Belmont and then the beginning of something new? Let me know. And also let me know in the comments, what did you think of season 4? What did you like? What did you not like? What do you think is going to happen as they move forward? Because I'd be shocked if they didn't have at least another season that kind of starts something new. Let me know what you thought of it or thought of the entire series.